hence abstractions, patterns, ideas of love, identity, promise, become far more real than particles that make them up. They wouldn't exist without the particles, of course, i.e. everything is nested in the logos, but without that spirit element, they are utterly meaningless. Say, that's truth and love, maybe. Logos and ethos, maybe. And that is not rational. It's not a rational thing. It's not that it's irrational or anti-reason. It's that it's not a rational thing. It's like, we do not see math. I said that recently. I think I was talking about, or maybe music. Music is mathematical. It's completely dependent on mathematics. And it has to be true. It has to be successful mathematics. But that is not music. There's these two realms that I'm always referencing, say, the phenomenological or kind of sensory realm, and then the sentient realm, maybe, and then the mathematical or information processing realm, the objective realm. So the objective realm is going to be cascade of processes without awareness. Objective realm. Cascade of process without awareness. Mathematics, tautology, objective, science, rationalism. Say materialism. There is no overarching ought to being. There is no God to inject purpose or design. Now, I think the trick becomes this observation that there's really no way to have any sort of, let me make that a bit bigger, and then there's the subjective realm. Subjective realm exists in subjective space, which means the space of conscious beings. Sensory, qualia, perceptual/conceptual. Narrative, perhaps. Everything depends on desires, POV, where you're standing. Now, Harris believes he's reconciled these. But yeah, a lot of these conservatives will go to these places, give their speeches. A student will come up and say, I don't believe you can get an is from an ought. And usually they probably thought it through and they're probably trying to articulate it, but it can be tough in that setting. And then they'll bring up like the Hitler example, of course. So was Hitler right to gas the Jews? And they'll give answers. They're trying to stay consistent, and they'll give answers like, I don't believe right can be a descriptive claim. I don't believe there's an overlap between descriptive and prescriptive claims. Descriptive being describing the way things work. X plugs into Z to produce Q. And prescriptive being we should do this. We ought to maximize well-being. We ought to treat people well. We ought not cause harm. You can look at bees or humans and you can say murder causes harm. That's bad. This society wants to avoid harm. You're describing this society, because they're humans, wants to avoid harm. They want to live in a society where they can trust one another, where their children will be free and safe. So they pass laws prohibiting murder and kidnapping. And then the laws are successful in that the people have a better life, so they're happy with them. So they continue to pass those laws and refine those laws. Now you're the entire time you're simply describing a series of actions humans are taking with a desired effect. And as long as they have the desired effect, humans will continue making those actions. And you could enter into that paradigm, accept that well-being is what the humans want, accept that free, happy children are what they want, and then you could work and analyze scientifically whether or not the laws are functioning. This is Alex O'Connor's Emotivism, for example. He's basically saying it's all just preference, from your favorite ice cream flavor to your great distaste for being murdered. It's all just a spectrum of preferences, varying degrees of emotional strength, but it's not an actual sort of truth claim or truth value that correlates with some set of facts in reality. This would be, going back to kind of theories of truth, correspondence theory of truth might say that a truth value has to correspond with some set of facts. So it's like, that which we call the moon orbits that which we call the sun once every however many days, hours. And if those facts are true, independent of my mind, then that's a true statement. He's basically saying moral claims such as you should not commit holocausts, you should not commit genocide, you should not throw eggs at your neighbor. those cannot be connected in any way to truth descriptions, truth claims about reality, because they're entirely grounded in preference. Now, if you accept, once again, that paradigm, we don't want neighbors to have strife, then you can go figure out, okay, yeah, so throwing eggs is more likely to cause strife. Morality itself does not exist in this rational sphere. It exists in the phenomenological or subjective sphere. Now, Harris thinks he's managed to, and many others think that they've managed to reconcile the two. How does this work? So the theist is believing that basically God is necessary to ground both of these, the subjective and the objective realm. That's because God is the source of not only natural law and reason and the logos of the universe and how things work and all the energy and blah, 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 but God is also, the spirit, the source of consciousness, the source of our free will or soul or whatever you want to call it. So God is actually the source of meaning and well-being and happiness. And you'll notice that theists, whenever they're asked to describe, what does it mean for God to have ordained a morality? What does it mean for us to act in a good way according to God? It just falls back on the same exact sort of language we would use, which is beings acting according to their nature. Things like life is good, love is superior, nihilism, suicide are not better alternatives, and we have to affirm the good in life and love one another because that's according to our nature, that's what we were designed to do. And it always ends up going to some ground zero, whatever, regressing to something like the Bible or accordance with nature or faith in, optimism and love are just better than the opposites. To me, it ends up appealing to the same things, which is this subjective realm. Now, you can say that there's a God as a subject who wishes these things in some kind of superior way or wiser way, but I think that if God is any different than natural law, it's still going to be a subjective wishing. The sort of wishing, the sort of meaning that exists is going to be in the subjective space, in the subjective realm. It can only be described with subjective language. That's a useful way to think about it. I really think we need to ask more, what are our interlocutors concerned with? Why are they using the sort of language they're using? And how can we make our language games kind of meet? Because, whatever, I'll talk about that more later. But, so the theists believe God is necessary to ground both of these. The, say, moral relativists or pure naturalists believe that you only have, say, reason. Wow, this is good. Reason. And that describes how things are, but cannot describe how things should be. So as soon as we describe how we kind of individually want things to be, then that can kind of bleed over into the subjective realm. But it's this movement from the objective to the subjective. And since the value exists over here, that's not a good place for that. Since the value exists over here, the value is just kind of determined by the finite being, the perspective of the finite being as produced by the rational, scientific material processing of things over here. So value is always going to be fluid, always going to be subjective, because the grounding is in mathematics, basically. So it's going to depend POV, and then Peterson would probably say with his existentialist view, or maybe I would say, that the subjective realm objectively exists, like I've been saying. These descriptions of these things are true and legitimate, and we have issues with translation. We have to make sure that what I mean when I say well-being and fulfillment and freedom is the same thing that you mean. But there is some objective calculus that could be done regarding our disparate ideas. If my children are raised with a certain idea of freedom and go out in the universe and end up suffering and, enslaving themselves and dying very young, and your children go out in the universe and multiply and are creative and artistic and just love life, then your idea of freedom was somehow better. So we could do a calculus, even if there's a disconnect. There is some quantity of well-being in subjective space that is being enjoyed by your children more. So there's kind of an objective calculus that can be done. But I would say it's completely nested in the mathematics of reality. So, and this is what Sam would say, I believe. So you can reconcile these two basically by acknowledging, how do you do this? Sam says, acknowledging that all meaning and value will ever only exist in subjective space. We must acknowledge that all meaning and value will only ever exist in subjective space. But subjective space is wholly nested in mathematical or reasoning mechanisms. That is a great text box. What's going on? Why is it like that? So he thinks he can reconcile them thusly. And then like I guess there could be another, could there be another realm for like pure idealists who believe sense data is completely unreliable? I mean, that's just like maximal hedonism. Yeah, I guess that's just like maximal hedonism, solipsism. Like, I'm the only one that exists and the only sense data that matters is mine, which is, perhaps how you could argue we should act, since I don't have to experience your suffering. I should just focus on myself. And that does lead to some terrible things. So the conservatives would all say, so they would say, that's what Hitler was acting under maybe. But they always ask, was Hitler like objectively right to do this? And the students are always like, we can't describe morality in terms of objective things like that because it's not an objective phenomenon. And then like, oh, wow, so there's nothing separating, keeping us from committing another Holocaust. It's just a matter of like, if we feel like it or opinions, there's nothing saying it's wrong. And that's not true. That's just a misunderstanding of what people mean when they say subjective morality. They're just saying the sort of thing it is. This is all, the scales are all wrong, but I hope you got the idea. Then Peterson is sort of saying this realm, say the objective, is too complicated. Too complicated. It cannot be known or methodized in the way Harris is proposing. What is more, there are metaphysical or spiritual dimensions to existence brought about by the interfacing of conscious creatures like us with finite structure. That's another key point. Value can only exist where conscious beings exist. So that's something key over here. Value only exists where consciousness exists. This is the observation of, say, the postmodernists or secularists most recently. And the theists are concerned that it means value will be divorced entirely from an objective conversation, therefore a conversation in which one side can be verifiably correct. That's the concern, and it's a valid concern. Then, what is going on? So then Peterson comes along and say he has kind of a meta idea of God. So let's put that even here. Peterson says, it's too complicated. It's too complicated. It cannot be known or methodized in the way Harris is proposing. What is more, there are metaphysical or spiritual dimensions to existence brought about by the interfacing of conscious creatures like us with finite structure. So these conscious creatures are interfacing with finite structure. And in this process, like he says, we evolved this thing, built from the ground up, evolved mechanism, perceptual mechanism, built from the ground up, takes in information like light, vibrations, selects for survival. Eventually, the smarter, more alert, more efficient shrews survive. Eventually, they become more social. Then new dimensions of survival come in, and the sensory apparatus must account for those. This becomes things like planning, recognizing the future, recognizing individuals, forming relationships, knowing who to trust, representing things abstractly through symbol. All these sorts of things cannot be captured in rationalistic language. You can describe perhaps, oh, this sort of being interprets this in such a way that it will react so. But you will never understand what that sort of thing means unless you, the describer, the scientist analyzing the species, have some sort of map for that sort of sensory experience, for that sort of conscious experience. So we could observe how little particles or aliens are interacting on a screen as pixels, and we could observe, to an exact degree the complexity of each pattern that produces certain response and which patterns are selected for, but you would have no idea what their experience was like. You'd have no idea what the landscape of their reality was like unless you could actually share in their mind and some pattern, some parallel, whatever, of their sentience. So Peterson is simply saying, what humans really care about, what is real, what can be directly known, what can be discussed, the only thing that can really be discussed is meaning or experience. This is also a very Harris type of thing with his Advaita, his mindfulness. So that's the only thing that can really be known. Hence abstractions, patterns, ideas of love, identity, promise, failure, success, become far more real than the evanescent particles that make them up. They wouldn't exist without the particles, of course, i.e. everything is nested in the logos, but without that spirit element, they are utterly meaningless. Say, that's truth and love, maybe. Logos and ethos, maybe. So when we embody particles fully in raw impulse, we are mere animals. That is breathing, that is flinching, that is fight or freeze or flight. But when we reflect and choose things and simulate and change or overcome our nature, that is human, and that is the core of being. That is the heart of who we are, and that is not rational. It's not a rational thing. It's not that it's irrational or anti-reason. It's that it's not a rational thing. It's like we do not see math. I said that recently. I think I was talking about, or maybe music. Music is mathematical. It's completely dependent on mathematics. It's dependent on the mathematics of vibration and the air and our ears and how we evolved to like certain frequencies and not others, and what's consonant and what's dissonant. That's mathematics. You cannot do music without doing mathematics. And it has to be true. It has to be successful mathematics. But that is not music. That's not listening to music. It's not a mathematical experience. It's not anti-mathematical. It doesn't escape mathematics, but it's not a mathematical experience. It's broader than that. So that's what I mean when I say it's not a rational thing. These abstractions, these stories, they're not rational things. It's like when he told Sam, that's not a fact. I forget exactly what they were talking about, but
what a biological organism does is take the facts and translate them into perception and action. And the only organisms that do that with one-to-one mapping are organisms that are composed of sensory motor cells, like sponges, marine sponges, which are composed of sensory motor cells. They don't have an intermediary nervous system. As that happens, and as the sensory cells become more specialized, and as the motor output cells become more specialized, many more patterns can be detected. Those are roughly equivalent to facts. And many more motor outputs can be manifested. But a tremendous number of calculations has to occur in that intermediary nervous tissue. And that's the structure that I'm talking about. That structure exists, and it translates the patterns into motor output. And it doesn't do it on a one-to-one basis because there are more patterns, more facts, than there are motor outputs. So what has to happen is this tremendous plethora of facts that surrounds us has to be filtered to the point where you pick a single action, because you can't act otherwise. And so the mechanism that reduces the number of facts to the selected action is the mechanism that mediates between facts and values. And it's not simply in and of itself, it's a fact that that exists, but it isn't a simple, that what it does isn't a simple fact.
Like when he told Sam that's not a fact. So Peterson observes, wow, this is becoming I hope you guys got an idea. So this is like a meta idea of God, which is kind of constructed in the meeting place between consciousness, where value has to come from, and reason, where structure and anything making sense and being coherent has to come from. Emerges from that our perceptions and the God that kind of governs them in this relational space that we're dancing kind of back and forth between what we understand and what we don't. And we're kind of speculating about what we don't. And every time it fails, we have to kind of amend our ideas or we die. So that's like natural selection. But then every time we embody something too completely and are just pure reason, we stop experiencing. So it's like a meta relationship, dancing around, dancing and producing this transcendence as it goes. And then Sam is on the other side saying, basically conscious, the flow of consciousness, the landscape of experience is the only directly knowable thing, and it's infinitely self-evident. It's the only self-evident thing indeed, even more so than logic. We trust pain and pleasure. Je t'offrirai de paires de pluie venues de pays où il ne pleut pas. Je creuserai la terre jusqu'après ma mort pour couvrir ton corps d'or et de lumière. Je ferai un domaine où l'amour sera roi, où l'amour sera loi, que tout sera reine. Ne me quittez pas, ne me quittez pas, ne me quittez pas, ne me quittez pas, ne me quittez pas. Je t'inventerai des mots sans sensé que tu comprendras. Je te parlerai de ces amantes-là qui ont vu 2 fois le corps s'embraser. Je te raconterai l'histoire de ces rois morts ne voient pas pour te rencontrer. On a vu souvent rejaillir le feu de l'ancien volcan qu'on croyait trop vieux. Il est, paraît-il, des terres brûlées donnant plus le blé de blé qu'au milieu avril. Yeah, I speak very good French. Very good. Okay, allora vediamo. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. There we go. Okay.